Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of the Precursive Perspective. Second podcast of the day today. So everyone will be recognizing my very fly New Vans shirt, which I bought in Brooklyn, Saood. Amongst the hipsters, I was navigating my way. It's great to see you. I'm delighted to be welcomed by Saood Shah, who is my work friend that I met on the internet. How are you, sir? Great to have you.
Hey, great to be here, Jonathan. Thank you.
And how's life? It's San Francisco you're in today, right?
In the greater San Francisco area, I'm in the East Bay, so I live in Fremont, and not quite as sunny as it usually is, but still, it's gonna warm up.
All right, good. Well, I might be over there later in the year, so if I am, we'll definitely be having a coffee or several beers. Well, listen, great to have you on. Give our guests a little bit of background to your storied career, the man, the myth, the legend, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. Hey, excited to be here today. I was educated to be an engineer, and I thought I would be an engineer. First job out of college was actually writing code for the Solaris kernel at Sun Microsystems. Very quickly found out that while I was good at writing code, I needed something more and felt like there was a customer-shaped hole in my life. And that brought me towards professional services. And so that really resonated with me. There was something about turning a customer into a vocal advocate when you know that you've delivered value, you've delivered results, and that customer is happy. It's a bit of a rush. It's an exciting feeling. And I think I never looked back. And so over the years, I started out as a professional services engineer delivering implementations for RSA security. And then over the last 20 years, I've had an opportunity to be in services, be in onboarding, and then run onboarding and customer success teams for a number of really highly successful SaaS companies like Siebel, Computer Associates, Contentful, Gainsight, to name a few. And now my most recent venture is to help customer-facing leaders everywhere with their onboarding and post-onboarding related concerns and help them derive that much more value, help them get outcomes from their processes, from their post-sales and post-onboarding processes. So really excited to help services and post-onboarding leaders everywhere.
Yeah, no, awesome. Yeah, I remember the story that you told me on like first returning guest you are actually. And I remember the story that you told about, I think the single sign-on for RSA, where the exec sponsor's like, come here, young man. And he explains to you exactly how much time and money you've saved us. And it's like, it's a great story. But I think that like grounding in business acumen really early, where I think you often describe it to me as like how you unlock that value or that improvement for a customer. It's a great thing to really get exposed to in the right way earlier in your career, right? I think anyway.
I think so. I remember. So I think we were implementing single sign-on for Halliburton across Texas and Austin and Houston, and this organization had thousands of employees, which were forgetting their password on a very regular basis. And so at the end of my implementation, I was just checking the boxes. He says, "Come over here, man. Let me tell you about ROI." And he explained to me how much time they wasted on lost passwords and how much they paid for our solution, and the numeric difference between those two numbers really really sort of drilled home the ROI of our solution, and more importantly, as an onboarding person, how much value I had unlocked for that particular customer. And it just like blew my mind there, and he was super happy. And so I think services, onboarding, and customer success leaders have a set of stories in their head corresponding to their most successful customers. I think we don't forget our happy customers, and it keeps us going.
So one of the things we're going to talk about later about I'm really excited to get you on. I think what you've done in preview for this episode is you've distilled a lot of the experience that you've had and you're producing some content on this, and you're helping customers and providing fractional services and helping them with their strategy and execution. And I think it's that learned experience that you're bringing back to folks. But I think the tying it back to revenue piece, which we're going to chat about, is super important. That's a great example of it. Now, I would venture that in this day and age, that handover document where was probably not present in that old project, right? Because these days you'd want that in there of like, this is the time that this solution is going to save you and the amount of revenue this is going to generate. And the onboarding or the services team, should know that and be like, yeah, yes, sir, I know exactly how much that improvement's going to make for you. So we'll come back to that. So just in terms of setting the scene then, like, I think for us, customer success starts with customer onboarding and services delivery. So tell us about why this has such an impact on client success and also company performance.
Yeah, I think you said it really well, Jonathan, and I've heard you say it in the past, and I'm a strong believer in the fact that the customer journey is really onboarding and then post-onboarding. And these need to be two different motions because our success criteria are different for each of these two different parts of the journey. So our success criteria, our methodologies, our engagement models, how we, our KPIs are all different. And so we need a separate onboarding strategy versus a post-onboarding strategy. And so that's why it's important to have a well thought out process for onboarding. And I think the second reason is because first impressions really matter. And confirmation bias is a real thing. And so data shows us and studies tell us that most people are very quick to create first impressions in their head, and then they're looking for data points to validate that first impression. And so why not have psychology on your side and really methodically and through a process ensure that your onboarding process is setting your customers on the right path towards their desired outcome. So ultimately, onboarding is important because it's a huge opportunity to set the customer on the right way towards success. I think the flip side is also true because studies show us that a poor onboarding experience, rather a poor customer experience, is responsible for about half of all churn, and about half of that is caused by poor onboarding. So about 23% of all churn is caused by poor onboarding. And so if you don't do it right, there's a huge opportunity to fumble the ball, and that'll lead straight to churn. And all of this can be worked on and this can be fixed. So it's not like product market fix for which you have very little opportunity to fix in the short term. Onboarding consists of a set of processes and methodologies that can be fixed, improved almost in real time.
Yeah. No, it's so true. I mean, I can name you specifically the accounts and the customers where, for us, right, that implementation experience and it was never, I don't think it was ever the value realization. It was the way that value was realized or the amount of time that it took to realize that was always held against us. Always was brought up during churn, and I would always talk to particularly some of the larger logos, not necessarily like ACV values in the early days. And it was always that. And it always pissed me off the most, but I was also accepting of it because I was like, we're still growing up in this area. And I have, now the churn issues that we face is driven by M&A, right? So it's people buying up some of our customers and then they get moved onto the mothership system. Or it's just product market fit where this company wants to have a services motion, wants to have like a PSA tool like what we provide, but actually the romance and the reality of their strategy doesn't quite line up, right? So they've kind of got this great tool, but they don't really need it because they're still kind of stuck in the past. But I've lived through everything that you described about the reality and the impact that it has on the customer journey. I think also segmenting it out like that, about understanding that there's one part and then there's another piece to it. But you've seen like services evolve, right? So you've seen the world of professional services evolve as an industry within SaaS. But what
Right.
you've also seen, I think, is the evolution of services delivery in some of the companies that you were in, like as they've grown over time and selling bigger deals, more complex, more multiple products. So help me understand what have been some of your experiences and observations about how that world has evolved, particularly around that shift from like more of like an onboarding motion into professional services, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think step one is really nailing your onboarding motion. And I think the example that I'll give is Gainsight services. And so when I joined Gainsight, we had a team of technical architects delivering the onboarding service. And it
Yeah.
was a single team, all delivering this rather tactical onboarding motion. And there were challenges. And so the data coming back from customers was indicating that they were not getting set up for the use case they signed up for. And as a result, they were typically in our churn call, in our churn meeting, they'd say, we didn't see the value that we were promised, or it was taking too long, as you said. Quality was hit or miss. And on top of all of this, we were losing money. And so our services team was fairly unprofitable.
Right.
And so these were the challenges that I was tasked with solving, as would any sort of services leader coming into the role. All
Yeah.
you, buddy, all
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll see you next week. Yeah. You have it all fixed by next week. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so digging deep into sort of why, into the why, the first thing I found was that everyone was doing onboarding in their own way. Every consultant had their own process. And what that meant was we had 20 different onboarding methodologies, some of which were super successful and some of which were not at all. And so there was no real set of best practices. So I think the first thing we did was standardize into a single best practice methodology, which then gave us the foundation to improve that methodology over time. And so that was one thing. And then very quickly after that, we recognized that the the technical architect was really trying to do two or three different roles. They were customer facing, and they were trying to do a design, and then they were trying to do a build as well, and they were trying to manage the whole project by themselves, and they weren't well suited for all three of those skills. And they were trying to do advisory at the same time, and they were just being pulled in 500 different directions, and it wasn't their fault. And so resource specialization was the second thing. Very quickly, we split the TA team into two teams, and we created solution architects and technical architects, tasked the solution architects, with most of the customer facing design work and solution design and documentation, and tasked the technical architects with the actual build. Then we evolved and added project managers into the mix, which were focused exclusively on pushing the ball forward, et cetera, et cetera. And then we found that the solution architects were not being strategic enough. And we needed the entire process to start with why, and start with the reason why the customer purchased the platform in the first place, which was the strategy of customer success. And so starting with an advisory consultant that's almost like a business consultant and can talk through the ROI and the business case of why the customer purchased, and that leads into the design, that really helped a lot.
Yep.
And then I think the third thing we did was focus on operations and drive operational rigor, measured the right metrics, and then created a process for continuous improvement of those metrics. And those were really three levers we used amongst many. And with respect to our results, we were able to bring time to value down from about 9 months to give or take 2.5 months. We became super consistent with respect to the quality we were delivering as measured by our post-implementation CSAT scores. And most importantly, we raised GRR by more than 5 points and had a dramatic reduction in the amount of churn that was being caused by the onboarding. And so that was an evolution within Gainsight. And then once we felt more comfortable with our onboarding motion, we were then able to evolve towards post-onboarding services, which we named TAM, Technical Account Management. Essentially, it was an opportunity for customers to purchase any of our consultants time for ongoing services. And we created value focused packages to help them get from one level of proficiency to the next and to the next, so that they're getting more and more from their Gainsight solution. And so, hey, that's a little bit about how I saw services evolve at one particular example at Gainsight.
Yeah, no, it resonates a lot. We had the same issue. We had technical consultants who were doing everything to about 2 years, probably 2.5 years ago in our delivery methodology. And I think also there are some subtle nuances to it, right? You kind of, when you grow up in that world, there's a little bit of a hero mentality as well. Like, I can do everything. I can do this, I can do that, because you've got smart people. I can do this, I can do that. And they're hardworking people. So I'll do it all. And then you just have these bottlenecks, you have burnout, you have suboptimal solutions. You don't have, people find it very difficult to push back in that environment, right? Because you build up this relationship and you're the only one. It's bringing tension into that's very hard. So I think that's the other thing about specialization, is it allows you to create kind of good cop, bad cop in your delivery motion, right? Where you've got someone who's the custodian of the timeline and someone who's maybe more the custodian of the solution, which is where the role of the PM comes in. So that definitely resonates. And I also think that, like, it's kind of those core components of, like, right, what's the methodology, and understanding how is it, all the differences, finding the best bits, because also there's some healthy crowdsourcing that happens there as well in terms of team engagement, like how you position that. It's like, let's create our best methodology and crowdsource everyone's input. Then there's the specialization piece, which I think people sometimes assume is like, oh, we've got to add a bunch of headcount. And it's like, well, yeah, but you're adding a bunch of throughput as well, actually, which we'll come back to. So no, I think all good insights. So I think what I want to look at now is you've spent a lot of time reflecting on, like, these different key components and tenets, which you called the 7 laws of onboarding. So take us, just give us a little bit of a background as to what are these different elements, and, like, you feel free to go through all 7, like, by name, and then we're going to deep dive into some of them. I'll kick it over to you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, the 7 laws of onboarding it's a set of best practices designed to help CS leaders and onboarding leaders cover the basics of onboarding. These are things that are really about essentially helping onboarding and customer success leaders drive value and outcomes for their customers with their onboarding motion. And it's for basic things like crafting an onboarding motion that works and is delivering outcomes to customers. How do you nail the handoffs between sales to onboarding to post-onboarding? How do you optimize for time to value? How do you figure out the optimal way to get as much value to your customer as quickly as possible? What are the right metrics to look at? How do you get to a point where you're consistently delighting your customer? And so when you focus on these, and there are there's tips and techniques and tricks to doing all of these effectively. And when you manage the customer experience in a thoughtful way, in a methodical way, as suggested by the 7 laws, essentially you're reducing churn, you're creating opportunities for expansion, so you're growing NRR, and essentially boosting your customer lifetime value. And so the point is, the 7 laws help SaaS onboardings and customer success leaders with their SaaS metrics by focusing on the most important, or one of the most important parts of the customer journey, which is onboarding.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that, a large audience here is professional services. I think we're using the term onboarding, but you could also interchange that for services delivery or implementation, right? So just for audiences in terms of the framing there, because I think the other element to this is, like, particularly when you think about what we're going to talk about next, which is around optimizing for time to value. I also, sometimes, like, operational excellence and, like, running a well-run business within a business, people don't necessarily draw the connection. They should draw the connection much more clearly between that faster delivery time and operational excellence and rigor, right? Like, in your old world, you may well have had, like, arguably the same team size that was delivering projects in 2.5 months rather than in 9 months, right? Right? You could well have been paying exactly the same amount for it, but it was a hell of a lot more profitable because you were booking more revenue, booking more ARR, getting more upsell, cross-sell, and you had higher GRR. So the overall profitability of the business and the services function went up as a result. And a lot of that is just linked to the fact of the time to value and the throughput, right? Because your people aren't, working across these projects that are going on forever. They're getting on to the next one. They're getting on to the next one. They're getting on to the next one, which I think sounds simple, but I don't always think that's understood. They're almost seen as like independent things sometimes, right? Like it's like, yeah, time to value and success metrics over here, and then operational metrics over here. And it's like, no, those are intrinsically linked. So let's talk about law number 2. So optimizing for time to value. So talk to us a little bit about kind of like how should companies be thinking about this and approaching this to do that?
Yeah, I think optimizing for time to value, law number 2, is probably one of the most important ones. The way I think about it, it has a profound impact on throughput, but also on the customer experience in general. By expediting your onboarding process as much as possible and getting as much value to your customers as quickly as possible, you're essentially creating confidence in the mind of your customer. And so the way I think about the how is I have a macro lens and a micro lens. So on a macro perspective, when you're thinking about your methodology, it goes back to sort of my example where it starts with standardization. And once you're in a position where you've standardized and you've set a best practices methodology, it's about indoctrinating the rest of your team with that methodology and driving it to a point where it is repeatable and you're doing the same thing over and over again until you get to a point where more than half of your team or more than half of your projects are being implemented in the same way, at which point you can call it consistent. And so you're consistently implementing in a single way or in a single methodology, which you believe is the best way. And that, I think, when you have your team focused in a single direction and implementing in a single way, that typically leads to quality. That's when innovation happens. That's when your best people come up with tips and techniques on how to do this faster. They'll think about, oh, well, if this is our goal, well, before everyone was doing it their own way, now I see that we are being asked to do it in this single way. And now the outcome or the desired outcome is that much clearer. If that's the desired outcome, then hey, we can get there faster. And this is how we should get there faster. And if you orient your entire team towards how do we get there faster, innovation will absolutely happen. So from a macro perspective, the way I see it is standardization leads to repeatability, which leads to consistency. And when you're doing the same thing over and over again, that inevitably leads to quality and improved time to value at a macro level. Now, it can sound a little squishy, but it works, and it's something to think about from how you evolve your methodology. Now, at a micro level, at a project by project level, there's also things that can be done to expedite time to value. And I think one of the biggest ones that I found, which is somewhat of an obvious one, but you'd be surprised at how many teams focus on this onboarding process as a big reveal, as a big bang finish at the end. Yep. Like, yes, yep, we're doing this onboarding and we're gonna reveal all of it at the end. And sometimes that can take months when really the optimal way to do it potentially would be, or could be, the customer is looking for a specific piece of functionality that is 70, 80% of the value of your platform to them. Timing the delivery of that feature sooner as compared to everything else can get them on their way faster. And so timing your deliverables to align with the value that they bring is one key thing to look at in your delivery process. I think 2 is segmentation. Not every type of customer should have the same type of onboarding. So having a rapid, quick onboarding with a single resource for your customers that need a fast, rapid onboarding, and segmenting your customer by need. So having a rapid onboarding for the smaller segment of customers, and then having an enterprise grade onboarding that has multiple resources. and a longer implementation timeline, it's more complex, can also lead to a faster time to value because you're implementing the customers that need less with a less complex implementation methodology. I think what we talked about earlier around resource specialization, when you have people that are focused on a specific task, they can typically do that faster with less context switching. So the entire process will probably go much faster when you have specialized resources for specialized tasks.
Yep. Yep.
And then something as simple as just improving the collaboration between your teams, improving the handoff between sales to onboarding. If you have multiple teams in onboarding and services, how you improve the collaboration and communication by documents and process, all of that can have an impact on how quickly you're able to get the process completed for your customers. So macro lens around standardization, repeatability, consistency, and then at a micro level, there's a lot of things that you can do at the project level to push the customer through faster.
Yeah, no, I like that. So I think on time to value, also, you want to be thinking about time to value to whom. And I was kind of counseled on this by one of our clients, which is a spend management platform, right? So they have part of the solution, which the financial accounts and financial director would use. And then they have frontline members of the team who do expenses. And so they were falling into a trap as they were doing some delivery whereby it was 3 months until the finance director was getting what they wanted, which was fine for the finance director. They were kind of like, I'm kind of okay with that. But everyone wanted to get off spreadsheets or photocopying receipts or whatever it was for their expenses. And so they flipped their methodology. So they did a 1 week rapid deployment for end users that got everyone going, yay! And then all good news floating up to the FD, for example. And then they focused on the second value moment. And I think, again, if you have a solution which has multiple user groups where you might be able to switch something on for one versus another, a lot of people focus on the value that they're going to deliver for the exec, which you absolutely should. But, you can deliver some good news stories more quickly if maybe you focus elsewhere as well. So I think that's very important. One other comment I would have around segmentation is, don't be too bold in trying to introduce fast start packages into your enterprise clients. Time to value of 6 months for an enterprise customer might be very rapid in their world, right? So context is everything. If you start trying to do stuff in a month or 3 months, they might just be like, oh, we're not even ready for that. So 6 months might be appropriate. So again, think about that segmentation and that timing. So let's move on then because as I was saying, I'm really passionate about the fact that I think that, intrinsically that, as you say, that experience, that throughput, that speed, that quality, that customer success, all has an impact on fiscal performance and operational rigor. So talk us through what I think is law number 5 around what are some approaches to this, which is mastering operational rigor?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things in mastering operational rigor, law 5. I think it's about having an eye on the right metrics, and let's talk about what those metrics are, and then measuring constantly and iterating ruthlessly. It's about constant and monitoring and then iteration. So in terms of the right metrics, I think you can break them out into almost like a project chronology. So thinking about the go-to-market, I think there's 3. You can measure many aspects of your delivery motion. And so I'm going to summarize by focusing on the 6 that I think that matter the most, and there's many, many more. But in terms of your go-to-market metrics, bookings, and ensuring that you're booking the right number of deals to ensure that you have enough work for your team is 1. And then the book rate and is also very important. So essentially that's how effective your selling process is and how effectively you're selling the value of your services as measured by bookings and the booking rate. I think the second category is like delivery efficiency. And what we're looking at there is bill rates, billable utilization, and productive utilization. So while booking rate was the measure of how effectively you're able to sell, bill rates is how efficiently you're able to deliver within the scoped amount of time that you have. And so bill rate reflects delivery efficiency, and then billable utilization and productive utilization are essentially measures of how much of your time you're spending on billable or customer facing productive work, all of which which are focused on the efficiency of your team and how much of your team are focused on billable or customer facing tasks. Finally, I think it's super important to measure the customer response as well. And there's two things that I like to look at religiously. One is CSAT, post-implementation CSAT surveys, looking at how customers are feeling about the implementation process and how well they're set up for success and whether they would recommend this implementation to friends, family, colleagues. And then also, I think product adoption. I think a key coming out of implementation or onboarding or any kind of service, change management and habit management is super key. And ensuring that the customer is using the product and measuring, having some kind of metrics around product adoption thresholds, which will drive customer success, are super important. So these are some of the metrics that I'm typically looking at. Again, it's bookings, booking rate, bill rates, utilization, CSAT, and product adoption are a few of the key metrics that I look at a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at how companies are valued, right, and how things are valued in our industry, a lot of it relates to the predictability, right, of something like recurrence, reoccurring. And then also the quality, right, of that thing. And I think, what you're highlighting there is the predictability of your sales motion, like how good are you at selling? You're talking about also then the velocity and the quality of what you've sold. And I think it can be overcomplicated. So I like the fact that you want to work back from the metrics. I think many organizations underappreciate when they can't see those things, it's like a frustration, but they don't necessarily understand the importance of it. And yet when you go and talk to someone in a larger organization or who's done it several times over, they're like, if I can't see that, then you're asking me to fly the plane blind, and that's a really bad idea because we crash into mountains. So it's interesting to see how a more mature operator thinks metrics backwards or metrics first. I don't know if you I'm guessing in your last gig, if you arrive somewhere and you're like, so hey guys, where's the report on this stuff? And they're like, oh shit, we don't, hold on, let me crank the crankshaft, crank the crankshaft. You're like, oh God, this is going to be terrible. Do you know what I mean? Is that fair?
I do. I think what I typically find is typically not only are we not measuring, we don't have the data to measure. And so the systems are not in place, and we're not tracking the data to put them into the systems to be able to measure. And so I think the first step is really aligning on what is it that we're trying to measure and why, and indicating that this measure actually indicates this behavior. And then creating the systems to track it religiously, and then making it part of your OKRs on a quarterly basis. Like, all right, this quarter, we're going to try to raise CSAT from an average of 8.5 out of 10 to 8.8 out of 10. And this is how we're going to do that. Similarly, this is how, if you have concerns with your margin, then thinking about, all right, well, which metric is it that's causing our margin to be low? Is it our bill rate? Is it our book rate? Is it our utilization? Why is our margin low? And then going and honing in on that specific metric and saying, okay, if our booking rate is low, that's probably because we're discounting too much, or we're not effectively selling the value of our service. So let's go work on our materials and our discount rate and try to raise our booking rate. And so you're absolutely right. it's important to know what the right metrics are and have the systems in place to be measuring them, and then make it a part of your quarterly goals to improve and iterate ruthlessly.
Yeah, I was gonna. So on that, then, what do you think is a good time horizon? Is it, when you talk about iteration, is it like once a quarter? Is it once every 6 months? Because could depend on how long your deployments are. But what is a good time horizon in your experience to be going back and revisiting these things? Because you can't change it every other week, obviously. But
Exactly. We can't change every other week, but I'm looking at these numbers every week. So from a visibility standpoint, I need to see these numbers weekly. And for slightly less mature organizations, I'm looking at them every 2 weeks. Now, in terms of making changes to processes, I think you need to let processes sit and you need to see the impact of the processes you currently have in place. So too much change is also dangerous. So I like to make changes on a quarterly basis. So we look at where we're going to land, we look at actuals for the quarter, and then we make changes, slight changes, we test, and then we make changes to, all right, here's how we're going to proceed next quarter.
okay. And then, we talked throughout this about tying it back to revenue, which is law number 4. So is that what it says on the tin? Is it having this fiscal awareness and tying it back to revenue?
I think, yeah, I think it's a realization, right? I ran services teams in the 90s and the early 2000s. And even though we were SaaS, there wasn't a reflection, there wasn't a realization that the services business was in support of the SaaS business. They were really being run as two different businesses, and services was tasked with a margin target of its own.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed for many organizations, but most organizations have moved on and really look at services and onboarding as a means to support the overall endeavor to raise GRR, NRR, and revenue and recurring revenue specifically. And so I think in terms of Law 4, tying it back to revenue, there's really 2 points that I want to make. One is we need to steer customers towards habits that lead to success from an ARR perspective. It's not about the services margin as much, it's more about ARR because SaaS companies are valued by ARR. So the question is, how do we build a services/onboarding business that focuses on ARR? Well, I can give you an example. At one of the places I was at, we were able to use data to drive a correlation. And we noticed that customers that had a specific level of product adoption were much, much less likely to churn and were much, much more likely to stay and grow. And so we realized that if we looked at it as depth and breadth adoption, so meaning if a customer was logging in more than 3 times per week, and breadth meaning if they were using more than 2 of our 6 sticky features, breadth of adoption. And so if they were logging in more than 3 times a week, and if they were using more than 2 of our sticky features, then they were more likely to stay with us. And so we crafted the onboarding motion to leave the customer at that end state where they were almost guaranteed what we perceived to be successful customer product adoption, which led to a successful retention or expansion. And so again, how do you figure out which behaviors lead to less churn and more expansion? It's about looking at the data on a regular basis and thinking about why is it that customers churn, and drawing correlations between customer behavior and churn on a very regular basis, and then pushing customers towards those behaviors that drive ARR. I think that's one piece of law number 4, tying it back to revenue, services in pursuit of ARR. I think the second piece is running services as a break-even business. And the intent there is to enable investment in continuous improvement and delivery of a high quality, memorable, differentiated experience. When you're not charging for services, then it's very easy to skimp on services and not have this adherence to a high quality, memorable, differentiated onboarding experience. But typically I found that if you're charging and if you're running a break-even services business, you're able to invest back in the form of free services, in the form of customer investment, in the form of high quality experience to ensure that that customer had a good quality experience. And so so how do you run a break-even services business? And some of the best practices that we discussed in law number 4, tying it back to revenue, is balance. So in my opinion, running a break-even services business is about balance. There's balance at the macro level and balance at the micro level. So at a micro level, on a per project basis, it's about aligning how much you're charging for the service with how many hours you have available to deliver. It sounds like a really basic and obvious thing, but align your onboarding methodology with how many dollars you're able to sell onboarding for. And if there isn't too much of a deviation there, on every project, you'll break even. At the macro level, you also have to have the right number of people for your team. And so balancing the number of projects you're selling with the number of people you have on your team also is super important in getting to that break-even number. And then as a side note, in terms of operational rigor, it's super important to be able to forecast that demand in terms of how many projects you expect to sell, so your hiring models are that much more accurate. So this is high level, but two of the high level heuristics I use to figure out how to keep things in balance in an onboarding organization.
Yeah, no, I love it. Love it. I mean, I think so for those listening, Saood and I are going to do a bit like a video tutorial actually on this last topic, where we're going to break down a model for, in effect, how you would build up the staffing profile, the revenue, the P&L for a fledgling services or onboarding team, right? So how you could think about that and what levers you could pull in terms of your attach rates, what you're charging, et cetera, et cetera. So watch out for that. And also you'll find, guys, on the listing for this podcast, a link which is xno.solutions/7laws. Sorry, I'm old school. So you'll be able to find out more about these 7 laws there. I do think just kind of going back to that last point for a moment, it always surprises me how finger in the air some of these charging and pricing of implementations or packages or services is. It's genuinely like we put our finger in the air, or they're doing it as a ratio of ARR to services where they don't want it to be more than 5 or 10%. And there's zero sort of spatial awareness about the fact that it might be, if we're charging 5K and it's taking us 50K of cost to implement, that this isn't very sustainable, which I think it's surprising to me. But I think some of these businesses, in some instances, they've grown so quickly, they just suddenly find themselves there. And it's like, okay, we're going to monetize. Let's charge 5K or 10K for this. I mean, a very well-known vendor in the sales enablement space, that's basically what they did. They were like, oh, we're going to charge package A 5K, package B 10K. Zero idea about how long stuff was taking. And I think that iteration point that you made earlier is so important. I can speak to my own experience. We have a delivery methodology. We charge on a fixed price basis. We then have packages alongside it. We'll also do T&M work depending on customization. And we've seen that as our methodology has improved, that the level of effort to deliver is coming down. So actually our estimations are too optimistic. They're too high. So our anticipated level of capacity is actually lower than it is in reality. But that only comes from this iteration and reviewing the data quarter over quarter. We had some new solutions that we were delivered those, get some reps under your belt, and then you can actually analyze the data and say, well, we thought it was going to take us X amount of time. It's actually taking us Y. And this has informed our hiring. It's informed our potential gross margin for the year, because we actually need to hire less than we thought we did. So all of these things sort of come to tie together, which is, I think, why it's such a fascinating topic. Greatly appreciate the time, sir. Hopefully you enjoyed that.
Oh man, it's always a pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan.
So brilliant. Thanks for having you on. As I said, guys, we're gonna have a follow-up to this with some like a video content and a webinar, which we'll be co-hosting and distributing through our different channels. Please, by the way, my marketing director is like, you always end these shows and just be like, all right, see you later. So I'm now tasked with saying, you know, on whatever platform that you're listening to this on, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Google, Apple, if you can hit like, hit subscribe, that really helps us grow the audience. That would be greatly appreciated. Shout out to Robbie, my VP marketing. All right, man. You have a great day. Enjoy the hazy day in San Francisco.
Thank you. Have a great day.